Professor Newlands, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
Thank you.
Let me start right away with the first question. In the light of your work on climate denialism and environmental media, how would you interpret the electoral retreat of both far-right and green populisms in the 2025 federal election? Does this suggest an emergent fatigue with ideological extremes or the recalibration of populist rhetoric within major party discourse?
So I think it's worth acknowledging the historical context of where climate change and climate denialism has sat within Australia. So there's been a slow increase over a series of election cycles where we've had climate change. So we've had a lot of election cycles where this election will be the climate change election. And in 2019, the from the left was very much about net zero, climate change impacts, climate change mitigation. And the reef became a very big focal point, the Great Barrier Reef, that's what I mean. And so because we've had this build up and we've had a pushback very much from the conversation becomes a sort of binary between the right and the populist that says it's nothing, there's not climate change, or it's not as bad as we think, through to the other kind of the more progressive area where it's been front and center. And so this has created a tension and it's made the debate very political. And as a result, the Australian political system has actually walked away from it. It's walked back from it. So it's not a question really of, it is a question to a certain extent of has the denialism and the populism worked? Because yes, now it's become an issue where politicians won't talk about it. So to the point, for example, in the election cycle with Scott Morrison, which was the one about 3-4 years ago, they made a decision, and that's, sorry, the Scott Morrison was the Prime Minister for the Liberal National Party, the Australian, the coalition of the right, if you like. They made a conscious decision to never use the term climate change in any of their campaigning. And so that's because it becomes such a hot potato and it would get hijacked the issue. So I think the understanding that landscape, if you see what I mean, and understanding that the constant pressure from the populist movement has just made the main political parties very risk averse when it comes to having climate change as an election issue. And so you have the Greens, obviously, which fill that gap, and you have some of the more sort of far left green groups as well, environmental groups. And you have a lot of activism and left progressive lobby groups that also fill that gap. And then there's a lot of kind of stakeholder players, but the actual sort of two political parties, if you like, the major parties, have a very low risk appetite when it comes to having climate change as an election issue.
Right. To what extent has the performance of populist environmentalism, particularly among regional independents, relied on symbolic appeals to land, livelihood, and sovereignty? Can these aesthetic registers be disentangled from the exclusionary logic of right-wing nationalism?
No, is the simple answer. So one of the so there's the right, the populist right in Australia is very conservative. It's conservative in it's quite protectionist. It's very nationalist, and it looks at Australia as a unit on itself, not within a global context quite often. And so with that context, when there are pressures, particularly on things like our UNESCO sites, like the Kakadu Park or the Great Barrier Reef, then it becomes a very sort of binary in the way that the debate happens. So that you will have a populist group very much say, oh, we're not having these international organizations, by that they mean the UN or similar, tell us in Australia what to do with our Great Barrier Reef, if you see as an example. Or they will kind of close down on any of the debates around having that influence from outside. So sometimes the debate around the climate becomes a debate about external international influence on Australian sovereignty and Australian political decisions, and on whether we, have a net zero target or not. So external becomes a bit of an enemy for the populist movement, which is very common. You know, it's really following that sort of that kind of playbook, if you like, of populism, where they create an enemy, and that enemy is from outside of Australia, which they use that then to garner support within communities, particularly, say, in Queensland, which is a coal mining. You know, we have two states in Australia. We have Queensland and we have Western Australia, and they're very heavy mining industry states. And so that kind of external create the enemy is then played out through the system and the debates in Australia, and particularly in Queensland, which, you know, is a huge state, but it also has the Great Barrier Reef. And then you have some minor parties such as Pauline Hanson's One Nation, which is a sort of to not far right, but to the right. And then you have like individual senators who will create that narrative a lot more and really use the populist playbook to create an impression as a threat to sovereign capability, not capabilities, but sovereign decision making when it comes to looking after, quote, our own environment and our own climate.
Right. Drawing from your research on social media ecosystems, what role did digitally mediated climate disinformation and blue denialism play in shaping voter perceptions of reef policy and environmental restoration during the recent electoral cycle?
So this one's an interesting one because, as I was saying earlier, the reef hasn't played a key part within the election narrative for the last couple of election cycles. So prior to the last two elections, so obviously 2022, it wasn't really a kind of part of the narrative. And 2019, it was a little bit, it was more part of the story. And social media played a very big role there. And disinformation definitely played a big role. And as you probably know from the paper that I co-wrote with my my former student, what we found with that is that particularly the traditional legacy media of the right, which in Australia is quite it's split between two. Effectively, there is the Rupert Murdoch publications. And a lot of those are regional publications. A lot of those are syndicated stories that will go across lots of different communities. And they also have the only national Australian newspaper, which is called The Australian. So you have a lot of narrative that comes from that, which is questioning decisions, which is looking at whether how much, for example, a net zero policy from the Labour Party would be costing somebody's back pocket. So that kind of economics versus the environment debate is very prominent. And then that's kind of reinforced by the climate denialism from some parties, or at least not necessarily the climate denialism. There is a climate denial machine for sure, as we showed in the paper, but there is also that sort of, well, we can't accept or we can't debate it as a cause of coal burning or carbon dioxide or human impact, if you like. So you have the two sides, and then the social media is just a platform in which that narrative and messaging is pushed. So that's where you get a lot of the disinformation. But you have to remember that you've got one group, which is the Murdoch press, which is very loud, and then you have the other side, which is very much more a kind of network. So you've got a bit of an echo chamber versus a network. And because our politics are quite binary in that respect, we only have we have the two. It's when it comes to things like preferential voting is when it's sort of, you start to see the impacts, but it's always the same way. It's the same arguments. It's the same populist arguments we hear in the UK. It's in Europe. It's, you know, that it's not man-made. It's nothing to do with coal, or if they don't go down that narrative, then it's, oh, well, your electricity bills are going to cost more, or you're not going to be able to keep the lights on. Or quite a common narrative around misinformation is that, you know, there'll be no power, and wind turbines only blow when it's wind. And it's a lot of those very classic kind of lines that you hear from a lot of other kind of populist parties, which are tried and tested and repeated every election cycle.
Right. How do you interpret the Greens' simultaneous Senate gains and House losses within the broader context of Australian environmental politics, does this reflect a strategic misalignment between parliamentary ambitions and the effective terrain of regional constituencies?
So this one's very interesting. So the Greens did really well in the last election back in 2022 by their standards. So they gained 2 inner seats and the seat of Brisbane around the Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland, if you're not familiar. Now, these 2 seats were actually heavily affected by flooding, which was a consequence of a heavy rainfall, but also we had a cyclone at the same time. And then that actually happened in the north of Queensland, and then the water all flowed down. So in that context, they did really well, but those seats were the lower house seats. So they were the House of Representatives seats. And they did have quite a prominent, they had a sway, if you like. They had seats within the Senate, but not as many as they do now. And so what's happening is, I think with the cycle, that those seats, they've only kept 1 of those 3 seats that they had in Queensland. And that's partly probably because people haven't had that lived experience of the flooding and the houses being flooded and the infrastructure. And they've sort of gone now back towards either the Labour, the main party, or the Liberal Party. But as you say, they've had an impact in the Senate. So in the Senate, they will hold the balance of power. So you have the Labour Party has the most seats, and then you have the Liberal Party or the Liberal National Coalition, because that's how it works in Australia. And then you've got the Greens, but the Greens will be, and they've got 11 Senate seats. So they will, in the upper house, if they do some bargaining and some deals with the Labour will have the 39 or more votes that they're required to pass through the Senate. So you're going to get a trade block, which is quite an interesting shift, whereas they've lost the power in the lower house. They only have 1 seat now, but they have a much bigger kind of power Senate if they align with Labour. So it'll be down to them to keep that relationship going, because the other contentious issue around climate is net zero targets in Australia and whether they're doable within the time frame. There's a whole set between 2035 and then another set by 2050. So those kind of elements, I think, so what I'm trying to say with that is that whereas in the last election cycle, you had a bit of an urban influence and not so much on the kind of regional influence. But this time, because Senate, the way that Senate's elected, you get X amount of senators for the whole state. They're not like particular seats, if you see what I mean. And so where regional votes will have come in and preferential votes have come in, it could turn out, we don't know yet, we haven't got the data, but it could turn out that's why the Greens have done so well in the upper house, but not so well in those urban inner city, inner suburb seats that they did okay in the last election.
Right. Given your leadership in reef restoration policy and Blue Humanities scholarship, how might populist critiques of technocratic ocean governance, often framed as elite overreach, be constructively re-engaged to foreground environmental justice and democratic inclusion?
So this one's an interesting one, because I think over time, the restoration, so the Reef Restoration Project and the Blue Humanities are 2 conceptual frameworks or 2 ideas that are novel, that are not something that have been thought about to a huge extent, say, for example, like marine science more broadly. So we've had small scale reef restoration for quite some time, but at scale, and that's why we're talking about at scale, it's about understanding the oceans and how the ocean systems work together. But I think it's important to note that particularly with reef restoration, a lot of it has been presented in a binary position again. So it's either we do interventions and save the reefs and save the corals, and that's around the world, or we do nothing and we let it die. And I think that has become problematic, and that's probably where you're talking about elitism. So it's sort of like, well, either let us do this, but don't, or it could die. So that kind of either or position. So I think there is quite a bit of work being done now. That's kind of how it started, like back in 2017, 2018. There's quite a bit of work being done now about the narratives around the ocean, our relationship with the blue, our relationship with the ocean. And we know for some studies as part of the Reef Restoration Project, for example, where they surveyed a whole bunch of people, and they did interviews, one-on-one deep dive interviews with more than 100 people. And what they found was when people actually experienced the reef, when they went into the water with snorkeling, for example, like tourists do, they found that people had a much stronger idea of like the elitism, that it's not just the playground for the scientists, that it's part of our community. And so the Blue Humanities enables, the idea with our book and the Blue Humanities is to kind of open up that conversation, to have the conversation about what do we need to do to help the oceans? What do we need to do to reduce climate change? And we don't necessarily have to do it only through the science. There are kind of sort of complementary ways of doing that. And so the Blue Humanities and the narrative are ways of kind of using the arts, the social scientists, the political, the historical, all those kind of, you know, areas to try and get people to understand where that conversation needs to go. So it removes that elitism and it becomes more of a kind of participatory action research process where people can understand a lot more by the sort of platforms and the ways that maybe their brain works slightly different to others. So I get what you're saying. It is technocratic and it is elitist. And, you know, it's the people that work on the RAP are fabulous scientists, absolutely amazing scientists, but they're also very engineered, sort of driven. And so it's solution-based within technocratic systems. And it needs to kind of, the Blue Humanities, as well as other methods, means that you can open up that storyline and you can create different narratives. You're still trying to get to the same goal of getting people to bear witness on what is required. It's just not within that kind of very pure science, fundamental, foundational science that they're trying to do within the RAP.
Right. What institutional safeguards or communicative strategies would you recommend to inoculate reef science and environmental policymaking against the populist backlash tactics identified in your recent analysis of media manipulation and science skepticism?
Oh, that's a PhD in itself, I think, not just a paper. And it's a hard one because I think, as I've alluded to, this is part of a global problem. This is very much a part of how people receive their information and how those narratives are framed. At the end of the day, there is a need for policymakers. Policymakers understand that, that there is a room, if you like, for restoration and other methods, traditional methods, if you like, for want of a better term, to happen. But it is a slow process. Regulation can be a slow process, unless we have something like the pandemic, where we've obviously shown there that we can speed things up. But I think it's something where you're going to have to really get that political. That's not just in Australia. That applies to anywhere where, in the case of restoration, you're looking at coral restoration, but you're also looking at ecosystem, marine terrestrial restoration, which has obviously been going a lot longer than ocean restoration. So I think it's about a coming together, but it's about shifting that mindset. And maybe it's also about some of the scientists being honest and realistic about what the capability of at-scale restoration will actually achieve, and then having a policy to enable that.
Right. In your work on gender and environmental activism, how do you see the gendered performance of care and stewardship contrasting with, with masculinist populist narratives of control, particularly in climate policy debates?
That's another biggie, isn't it? So I think one of the things that I think of so there's a couple of things there. I think it's very interesting in the last election cycle here in Australia. We have what the independents, some of them have been called teal. So it refers to that they have the climate change mitigation and adaptation as one of their key policies, but also they have a bit of an economics kind of approach to it as well. But they are all independents, and then in 2020, because they began in 2019, and then, well, they have been working quite a long time, sorry, and being independent, but they started getting financial support from Climate 200 in 2019. But my point is that a lot of these independents are community-based, but they're also city-based. But they're all predominantly women. They're not all women. There are, there are some men in there as well. And I do think that, there's almost a bit of, like you say, with the knitting nanas, and partly, I think you'd have to talk to the independents, but they're both coming from a place where they found that patriarchal system has been very much been kind of putting them into a framework, and it's hard for them to come out. And that's within politics, both at the kind of mainstream and also within the knitting nanas. So, one of the things, I'll give you a little anecdotal story. One of the reasons that the knitting nanas started, and that as a female specific movement around anti-fracking, was because when they went with other ENGOs, other activist groups, such as Lock the Gate, which is where some of them started, they personally found that their role was not on the front line talking to the media or leading the march. It was, they found they were being kind of pigeonholed in the kitchen on the camps, providing that very traditional kind of homemaker role. And they felt that, that wasn't what they were there for. They were there to be on the line and to be there equally, which is why the knitting partly started, the knitting nanas started as a female only. And I think there is this gender shift, there is this kind of movement, particularly within the activist movement, but more so now with the independents, where you're seeing that women, it's not a gender issue per se, it's just women are getting to the stage where they're running, and it's just part of a bigger movement. You've got to also note that we've only ever had one female prime minister in Australia since Federation in 1901. Yet now we've now got parties. So the Liberal leader is the Senator Susan Ley, and also the leader of the Greens is Larissa Waters, and then of course the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. So it's a real shift within the very conservative culture of Australia, and particularly conservative politics of Australia. And I think we're slowly starting to see that change through things like the independent movement, the Teal movement, the community independent program, and the funding that is being provided by philanthropic and by grassroots contributions is sort of enabling that to happen. And so it's a real sort of beginnings of, hopefully, a more parity within the political system.
Right. Given the strategic expansion of community independence into regional and rural electorates, how sustainable is their model of hyper-local environmental governance amid the entrenched political economies of extractivism and agrarian populism?
I think time will tell. I know that's a very wishy-washy answer, but I guess time will tell in Australia, particularly because we'll see whether Australia follows that similar pattern that we've seen elsewhere in the world, where people are moving away from that traditional kind of voting of the two major parties and looking more towards the independents and the minor parties. And from that, they're looking at them particularly because of those hyperlocal issues and the issues that are mattering on the ground. So things like healthcare, education, nursery care, daycare, early childhood, that sort of area. But also the way that they position themselves is to kind of not make that agrarian sort of approach the focus. It's just about a community as a whole and what are the needs of the community. And it's something that we've seen that space being sort of the independents encroaching on that space, whereas we've seen, say, the traditional conservative in some states, not in all states in Australia, we've seen the traditional conservatives and the coalition, some of those, well, particularly the Liberals, the Liberals are conservatives in Australia, move away from those rurals. Because if we look at the last election, for example, the party that only lost one seat as opposed to, over sort of 40 seats was the National Party. So the National Party are a regional rural-based party in Australia. They're a right-leaning party. There are some progressives within that party, and there's some populists within that party as well. But they've actually retained that. So having that sort of, the agrarian populism has played okay for them. They have kept their base. And so that we've still got that. So it's the Liberals that are kind of finding their way. And that's why at the moment there's I think a bit of a side debate taking place on whether that coalition between the Liberal Party and the National Party will actually, stay as it is, because people obviously are voting for those rural and regional issues because they're voting for the independents and they're voting for the Nationals. But I don't know how far that how many cycles of election we'll see that either build or whether it was just an anomaly for this one.
All right. To what extent can the cultural narratives embedded in the Blue Humanities reconfigure public imaginaries of marine ecologies in ways that resist populist reductionism and foster more pluralistic ocean ethics?
Yeah, so I think the key with that would be to have that kind of variety of pluralistic voices. So as I talked about earlier, to have a different lens in the way that you tell the story of the ocean. And one of the key ways of doing that, I would suggest, is the co-design with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly in Australia. They have lived on the land for a lot longer. They've lived 65,000 years. They understand how the land and the oceans work. They understand, the cycles and the sort of the way that the system works. And something like the Blue Humanities, that it's not about co-opting, and it's not about imposing. It's clearly just about understanding different ways of thinking and different ways of looking for solutions. So it's certainly not around, that sort of cultural adaptation of Indigenous knowledge, but it's being willing to just at least understand it and learn about it. And then, you have two different systems running in Australia, particularly around marine science. And so there are projects by the Australian Institute for Marine Science, for example, where they have a whole kind of division, a strand, or I'm not quite sure the technical term, but that's very much around assisting Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. But it's also about giving them autonomy and support to do their own projects. And at the same time, you have the scientists understanding that when they go on to sea country, when they go on country, that their respect needs to be shown. And that isn't something that's been happening 10 years ago. So looking at the Blue Humanities and looking at the kind of cultural components that make up Australia, understanding that if you're not, it's not about adopting it, but it's just about recognizing and understanding and accepting and seeing how those two things can possibly work together, whether it be, side by side or through a process of sort of co-design, and obviously about collaboration. The Blue Humanities, the idea is that's where we have authors from Torres Strait and elsewhere, is to try and explain to people, that may not be familiar, how you can understand the relationship with water and the ocean and the marine space, which isn't that traditional, science-based, pure science, basic science kind of approach.
Right.
Just going to have a cough. Sorry, talking too much.
How should we understand the electoral backlash in coal-reliant regions as both a repudiation of top-down climate policy and a symptom of deeper socioeconomic dislocation? Can climate justice be effectively articulated in such communities without capitulating to extractive populism?
I think it can. I mean, the classic that comes to mind is Queensland. In Queensland, we have strong senators who have sort of adopted some of those populist sort of strategies. But at the end of the day, those communities have been heavily reliant on the mining industry. the mining industry has been a key source of employment, and the debate politically has often been framed around the loss of jobs, but there is just about enough space within those communities for alternatives. So we hear about things like just transition, moving away from those mining industries. But when I say mining, I mean fossil fuel mining, coal, etc. And looking more, that's in those areas. But there are, we're not mining in Australia, but it's around creating communities that are provided with an alternative so that those communities don't just die off, because the industry has kind of moved away. But by the same token, we still have a lot of mining in that area. So of coal, with say the Adani, and it used to be called the Adani mines. It's now Gravitas, the company it's called in Australia. So we've got those communities, and that's where that tension and that electoral backlash has come back from. You've also got embedded in that the conservative values, particularly of that state, and they're tapped into very much around a narrative and a populist narrative around the north-south and us and them. So we had a classic campaign run by the Nationals in 2019, so our two biggest cities in Australia, if you're not familiar, Sydney and Melbourne, are south of Queensland. And they were running this, a car bumper sticker, like a sticker that goes on the back, and it said something along the lines of, and excuse me paraphrasing, but along the lines of, if you don't take my mining jobs, I won't take your soya latte. And what they were doing now was creating that binary populist, don't tell us what to do. We need the mines for our jobs and our families, and we won't take away your sort of cup of coffee. And so that kind of whole pushing of the populist rhetoric was up against a lot of activism, like the Stop Adani campaign, for example, which was trying to prevent the big mine from opening up. And so we're still trying to find those areas where those communities can transition. But you're right, the backlash has come because of that. Again, it's either jobs and mining or it's not, and that binary kind of arguing or positioning, if you like. But ultimately, those communities are going to have to find an alternative, or not those communities per se, but the politicians and the governments of the day. And one of the conversations that was had in the last cycle was around nuclear. So we're not a nuclear country. We have a moratorium. We don't have nuclear power stations. We have one nuclear facility, and that's generally for regional sort of scientific and low-grade health. So they were trying to introduce the debate around nuclear power stations as a sort of alternative for those communities, but that hasn't really worked at all in the favour, because it's not a long-term solution. So that kind of repudiation is then getting folded in to the whole debate around what do we do, but it's a grassroots community-based debate, and those communities are the kind of they're being held up as the people that are either the victims or they're going to be the winners out of whatever the policy is, yet to be decided.
Right. And finally, Professor Newlands, do you perceive any co-optation of environmental discourse by far-right actors such as eco-nationalism or green nativism? And if so, how should progressive movements strategically differentiate themselves in such contested semiotic terrain?
So I don't know if we have, in Australia, we have that kind of level of that sort of more to the very, do you mean like the far left you're talking about? Is that sort of what you mean? Just so I'm clear by your terminology. Do you mean like the sort of green anarchism stuff, or not so much?
Not much.
Not that much, that much. So, I mean, we do have, we have lots of groups, and we have lots of progressive groups. We have lobby groups. We have groups like Get Up, and we have, like the Bob Brown Foundation. But whether we have them that far in Australia to have an impact, I don't know. And it's not something that's been registering on the last election cycle or on previous elections. There will probably be minor parties that are, thinking about that, or it may be independent. So we don't really have that kind of anarchy sort of spectrum in Australia that is part of the national debate around elections and the Greens. We have people that are more proactive and people and organizations that have events. So they may put on a protest, they'll put on a high profile protest, or they'll take their position to Canberra in order to generate that kind of public awareness. But they are like that. So I'm thinking of organizations that have been led by former leader of the Greens, for example, like the Bob Brown Foundation. But to the point that it's sort of anarchy, I would say, personally, I'm not aware of anything. That doesn't mean it's not there. So it's hard to measure. I mean, you've kind of got the middle ground. You've got Labour, which are progressive to the left on the environment. Yeah, and they're going to bring in their net zero targets, and they have a whole suite of regulation and policy that they want to called nature positive, which includes things like, biodiversity credits as well as the net zero. And then you have sort of the Greens a little bit more, if you like, and then maybe a couple of others. But they generally tend to be more the activist groups, the lobby groups, the advocacy groups. So things like the Environmental Defence Office, which is a group of lawyers, which will help activists, or advise activists, like the Knitting Nanas. They used to work with them. But we haven't got them that far. So, but let's see what happens. It's the fact that the Liberals lost so many seats this time around, it gives the Labour, and as I said earlier with the Senate, a much bigger block to get things through. So, for example, in the last election, there was a bit of caution that there's that whole suite of portfolio of environmental policy and regulation under the nature positive wouldn't get through enough, so it was withdrawn. So we'll probably expect that to see a version of that come back, because there'll be more confidence in getting those sort of through, which then, of course, naturally negates any of those more further right amplifiers, because the main bodies, the main political parties, are already doing what they may be wanting in the way of regulation.
Professor Maxine Newlands, thank you so very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.